I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector News Podcast. And joining me is a repeating guest from down under, Dr. Dave Lawie, the Chief Geoscientist from Imdex. Welcome, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and it's good to be back again.
It's good to have you back. And for those that have caught the first couple of these podcasts, it's been kind of gloomy, hasn't it? We've talked about the gap that is currently existing in the critical metals to get us to where they want us to be in order to meet the global emission targets. And we've made it kind of sound like a bleak expedition that has no chance of success.
Challenging. Bleak might be too strong a word, Mike, but yeah, but yes, quite bleak, quite challenging. I think one of the themes behind it is the lack of thought with the policymakers that goes into what needs to happen to achieve the targets that they're setting in public. And I just don't think they think that through properly. Why don't they think it through properly? I'm not sure. Maybe it's bad advice internally, but it's not limited to one government or another. It's pretty universal. But I think it's just that fundamental lack of input from people who really understand the extractive industries and what it takes to get your hands on resources and extract them and process them and put them into the market to allow a lot of the technologies to be brought into the market to help with the decarbonisation.
Yeah, and as I say, that's been our previous conversations. Today's talk is to show that this isn't an exercise in futility, and that these gaps can actually be bridged and in a reasonable amount of time. Not necessarily their current targets, but within a reasonable amount of time. We were shooting for a global target that if you believe the numbers that came across this summer, we just blew past, and we blew past that about 8 to 10 years in advance to when they thought the danger point was going to be. Now, it may have been just an anomaly for this year. We'll have to see going forward, but I think the first thing the governments need to do is re-examine the targets and try and determine what targets are actually achievable, as opposed to they seem to have set targets without any thought to whether or not we can get there. And hence we end up with the gap we've discussed.
Yeah, and I think and you're quite right, the rate of, where we're heading, according to what was defined in the Paris Agreement, we already seem to be in advance of some of those predictions. I think it's really important here that we don't give up, if you like. And I think one of the dangers is that with some of the targets that have been set being unrealistic, if we end up with a theme of catastrophism, as I call it, when people talk about this, then people throw their hands up and say, well, we can't do anything, and just go and stick your head in the sand. And that would be a disaster. That would be the bigger disaster as the outcome here. So I think you're right with your introduction, is that catastrophism is not helpful. What is helpful is engaging the wider community with what we can do. And it may not be exactly what the governments have set out that we can do previously, but we can do things and something, and we should most definitely get on with all of them. The other quote I like, which gets bandied around this issue, is there'll be no one silver bullet that can solve this problem, the decarbonisation problem. The fact is the world will need every last single bit of technology it can lay its hands on and use it all at the same time just to get our carbon emissions down in a sufficient amount of time. There's another very good quote here. It's very, every molecule of CO2 that goes in the atmosphere doesn't have a tag of where it came from, but they all count, right? So anything that goes in the atmosphere counts. The stuff that we've put in there now, we will be feeling the ramifications for decades to come. You can't, whatever's been set in train now, it's not going to stop overnight. So anything we can do to ameliorate the CO2 that's going into the atmosphere in the meantime is all important, not necessarily for us, but certainly for our kids and grandkids. They're the ones that will benefit the most for us throwing everything we can at this problem over the next decade or two.
Yeah, government policy certainly has a long ways to go to do this. One of the challenges I've always found is that the government seems to be when it's setting the policy around these targets, it's always been black or white. Oil's bad, electric's good, so all cars must be electric by 2025. Yet we don't have the technology, the minerals, the battery materials to actually achieve that. Yet if you were to take a gasoline powered car and even switch it up to a hybrid, it is less bad for the environment. Hybrids are proven technology. We know what they can do. And that would have been, that could be a good stopgap going forward. But government policy seems to be black and white. How do we get the government to gray their policy somewhat so that we can make incremental steps towards the goals?
I think the government ultimately will have to listen to the market and the people. I think that initial blush of enthusiasm to be, to have EVs absolutely dominate the fleet on the road is actually going away. There are a few problems with it. EVs are expensive and people aren't stupid. So if they've got to spend on average 10 or 20 grand more per vehicle to get one, that's a problem for, most of the population. The adopters, it's not for most of the population. It certainly is. The materials that go into them, the fact they're charged, when you charge your EV from the grid, that grid is not itself at the moment powered by renewables. So it's just using the fossil fuels like everything else, mainly, most of the time, most parts of the world. They are very energy intensive themselves to make. And if you look at some of the analyses, that if you have a relatively large EV, the energy that goes in just to constructing the thing and obtaining the critical minerals that go into it, the copper, nickel, cobalt, etc., even over its lifespan, it never brings the carbon benefit over and above an internal combustion engine car. And that's mainly due to its input costs, but also due to the fact that the typical grid around the world that it runs off is not solely powered by renewables. But that's trying to jump straight to an endpoint. In the meantime, a hybrid vehicle would bring quite a few of the benefits, probably get better market penetration, and remove some of the other things that block people from buying EVs. Like I think that people call it range anxiety, which who would have thought they would talk about something called range anxiety with a car? But it also gets rid of that problem, and they are a hell of a lot more efficient than conventional internal combustion engine cars now. So I think it's an example of something that's not as endpoint as everyone wants it to be, but it's a step along the way and more achievable. I've listened to people, there's an Australian who was the father of veganism, I think, and just lately he's been talking and saying to people, and bear with me here, Michael, it's related to this discussion, but talking about veganism, he said, to help the planet, rather than trying to talk people into not eating meat, turn them into vegans, it's actually much, much more helpful for the planet if you can talk the vast majority of the people into eating less meat. Is much more impactful. And in a way, that is it's a nice way to also think about a decarbonisation problem. There might be some pure holistic light on the full thing that we want to do, but we'll only get a very small proportion of whatever activity is to that point if we can move the vast bulk of things along a technology path which starts to eat away at the problem earlier. Ultimately, that will be more impactful.
Yeah, and I could speak to the Canadian government. We are an oil and gas producer, actually a pretty significant one in the world. And our federal government seems to be intent on driving the industry completely out of business. Yet if we were to take our natural gas and use that to convert large coal-powered generators across the world to natural gas generators, again, stepping stone, we would actually reduce our carbon footprint by more than, taking the entire auto fleet in the country and making it electric.
Yeah, the gas-fired power is really interesting. The Gram, well, that situation in Canada, you have a lot of hydro in Canada as well. If we come back to Australia with our coal-fired power, the plan, if you like, the plan, and using quotes 10 years ago, was in the conversion to renewables. Everyone knows there's a problem with the renewables not being providing a constant source of power for whatever reason, sun, wind, tides, whatever. But the thing was to get the big giant coal-fired power stations closed down and offline, because you just can't turn them on and off or throttle them. They need to run at a certain rate to make them efficient. But the plan was to progressively shut them down and start building smaller gas-fired power stations, which can turn on and turn off in response to the renewables going on and offline with what's going on. Now, that was a very, very sensible idea, but in Australia, at least, we managed to have stuffed up our own gas market, just the price of gas, which seems to have made that uneconomic. But it's a concept or a thought that is not even spoken about much here, just being able to do that. And I think it's partly the economics. I think it's difficult to make a business case for it when the government, the federal government and state government legislation is so poorly written and can't give the people who would make those investments the trust they need to make that investment to put it in place. The other attraction there is, if you do that, is you can put these gas-fired plants where the coal ones are, which are already linked into the grid, and you don't have the complications of running large transmission lines across half the country to connect remote areas into the grid either. But I still think those things should be on the table, right? Yeah, okay, so it's still emitting CO2, but a lot less than carbon. But with the added benefit, that's why they're generating power, but with the added benefit that during the day, when you've got the duck-shaped generation curve from solar, then these things, you can actually turn them off and then then they can fire back up again in the evening when the sun goes down and there's no wind power. We have already here in West Australia, you might imagine solar's prevalent almost every, I think it's on a third, if not more houses and on businesses. At some points in the shoulder seasons here, we're already generating more rooftop solar than the entire Southwest grid can take. And so the power companies are paying one of the big sporting stadiums here to turn all its lights on during the day just to suck power, because the coal-fired power station still needs to run. They're just the weird dichotomous situation we found ourselves in now.
Yeah, that is strange to hear that they have to turn the lights on during the day because you need to keep the coal-powered plants running. It's one of the things that I've always thought that, solar has value within community environments that are already hooked up to the grid. But when I hear of these huge solar farms, they're like in parts of the world where nobody lives, and then they have to run all this extra high tension power lines to get it connected to the grid. And to me, if we're talking about the gap to achieve our goals, that's actually pushing the target further down the road, because they need more copper, nickel into these power lines to get it to hook up to the existing grid. Or am I out to lunch?
No, that's not out to lunch, that comment. And the other complication with it is that if you're going to start running these big high tension power lines in Australia, the US, and elsewhere in the world across the country to start linking things up, the local landowners, be they farmers or Indigenous communities, are typically not happy, to say the least. They don't want these giant transmission lines marching across the countryside through their land. And let you give you a real world example of that, of something that's going on in Australia right now. So, some people that are listening to this will be familiar with the Australian Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme. It was a giant civil project to deliver hydropower built in the Snowy Mountains in Australia. And yes, to some listeners, we do have some mountains in Australia. Over on the East Coast, it was a giant post-World War II project. There was lots and lots of immigration to Australia. It was basically built by European immigrants after World War II. It was a massive, massive project, big success. you know, a bit like the US building its highway system after World War II, that sort of thing. So it is successful and it's there. But then when we're looking for 6 or 7 years ago, ways to fill the gap when, you know, to have a source of renewable energy, which is dispatchable or more like base load than with power wind. So the Snowy Hydro scheme, they looked at that and dusted off some plans where they could build a very, very large pumped hydro battery, if you like. So just during the day when the solar's running, fill the dam up at the top of the mountains and let it down when you need to generate power, turbines at the bottom. Simple concept. Now, this is just not any old hydro project. Snowy Hydro 2, as it's called here, would if you had the top dams filled up and let it run, it could power 3 million houses for a week without any other source of power. Exactly the sort of bridging measure you need to go from what we're using now with a mixture of coal, etc., to get us through to a renewables future, because the current battery technology is not going to do that, right? It can't power. I don't know what sort. I don't even know if it's feasible to have a battery farm that's going to power 3 million homes for a week on the grid in the east coast of Australia. So great idea, but few problems with it. The initial cost estimate was 2 billion. Then at the end of 2017, they relooked at the project, went up to 4.5 billion. That's okay. Then by April 2009, it became 5 billion. The project is massive. They have a couple of enormous tunnel boring machines. And then there was a story just in Australia just a few weeks ago saying that one of the tunnel boring machines actually hadn't moved for 18 months. It had just gotten into the ground to start boring and got bogged, literally. And why did it get bogged? Because at the start of the project, and this brings us back to the resources industry, it's an analogy for mining in some ways, they didn't do enough drilling in front of the tunnel boring machine to define the ground conditions in front of it. And they hadn't worked out that there were geotechnical problems, there were structural problems, there were soft ground problems, there were water problems. And they managed to cave in the ground around it. There was a lot of water and the thing got flooded and stuck, and that's where it still is. So this is a project that the country needs. It fits into our decarbonisation strategy like a hand in a glove. We managed to stuff it up by literally not spending a few $1 million on additional data gathering before the tunnelling started. So the running cost now, the latest estimate is to complete the project is 12 billion, and we're still counting. You can add to that the fact that because this isn't complete, we are going to have to keep some of these older coal-fired plants running for possibly 5, 6, 10 years beyond their use-by date. You can add a cost of about $10 billion on top of that. To bring it back to the solar analogy, the scheme itself needs to be plugged into the East Coast grid in Australia with 2 large interconnectors. The cost of that's gone from $2 to $10 billion, I think, and the landowners are not happy. Right, there is no guarantee that that these things will actually be able to be built. All of the landowners, of course, want the cables to be buried underground, but the cost of that will be even more hideous. So the end story, Mike, is that this Snowy Hydro scheme, which is in concept a fantastic scheme, would very, very much help Australia in its energy transition, ends up with a cost of about $30 billion rather than 4, or largely for the sake of not spending a bit of money getting some geological information at the start. And to give you a point of reference, the channel, the channel that links France and England, in today's dollar terms, costs 35 billion. So, you know, that's a good concept. It fits into the decarb narrative perfectly. It's something the country really needs, but we've gone and stuffed it up badly, really badly. And I don't, these, you know, it's a technology that it's great, but we can't afford missteps like this with the various technologies we bring to bear. We really can't.
No, and I was noticing as you were telling that story, you're going to have your coal-fired power plants running longer, so that's going to be more carbon there.
Yes.
You know, there is going to be more minerals needed because they were going to have to hook it up to a power grid and go across land in order to do that. You know, that's where I talk about policy. Like they seem to want to have these big grandiose projects that, you know, appear perfect, yet there's probably less perfect projects that would get the job done. Running back to the car, in North America, we have an electric vehicle called the Chevy Volt, which is, it's expensive. It's about $60,000 the last time I checked. But everyone wants the perfect Tesla, which is $130,000. So, but the Chevy Volt will still get you point A, point B. Its battery range is probably the same as the Tesla. But everyone seems to want to run to perfect.
Yeah. The logic of the bits and pieces that we use at the moment I suppose aren't connected. There are benefits in EVs, like they do the energy that goes into them versus the energy in gas or petrol goes into internal combustion engine. I mean, 980, I think it's 85% of that electrical energy does go into the drivetrain and move the car forward, whereas an internal combustion engine, it's more like 15 or 20%. So there are other sources of efficiency in them, which typically don't really get accounted for, which is a thing. But I think, with time and, the little bits we can do in time that aren't necessarily the light on the hill, I think things like, well, take the Snowy thing where I spoke about $30 billion, whatever it will cost in the end. Maybe if you look at that, go, well, the geotechnical risks are too high or been so badly mismanaged that we can't rely on that being completed in a rational time frame now. Why don't we look at community batteries, right? Suburban block scale batteries, and subsidizing those to go in, because they're, in a way, then you can actually encourage people to put more solar on their roof. At the moment, people almost actively discourage in Australia, almost. And in fact, the power utilities can come in over the network and turn your solar off now to stop it destabilizing the grid. That's how much we generate in Australia now in many cities. But if all of that excess was going into community batteries, which then flow back to those homes in the evenings, to stop that shoulder effect and creating the problems of the coal-fired power stations, maybe that's a better investment at that scale, right? I could see a world where, when there are more EVs, be they pure EVs or hybrids that are plugged in around the suburbs, that those community batteries are going into charging those vehicles, or those vehicles, because they carry a lot of power, right? They're 70, 80 kilowatt hours, the batteries in the vehicles that make the things you put in your house look small. But maybe they are sitting there and powering the suburb overnight, and then being recharged at work during the day off the solar. There are things like this which can be done. I've often thought that, and a bit like the vegan conversation, little things add up and become big things. One of the things I've always thought about, just people, if you give people the right information, they typically react well to it. So if all of the power generating companies just put a giant power meter on the wall of the kitchen in every single home, so every time you plug something in or plug something out or did something, was telling you in real time what your power consumption is and where it's coming from, then I think people would self-modify their behavior and possibly reduce the demand for power by 25%, right? And especially at times of day when it's relied on burning coal rather than using renewables. So these little things, these are achievable, right? They're not going to break the bank. They're achievable within the next few years. They start to get things done. They shift the mindset of the community. The community feels more involved, rather than a bit like you and I, Michael, not trying not to turn into old blokes shouting at the sky, shaking our fists at it about what the hell's going on. But I think the community and the world in general needs to explore some of these, I suppose, less sexy, less soundbite news announceable things that may actually be more impactful and get more done in the next 10 years.
Well, I don't disagree. I believe oftentimes government gets in the way, and that kind of takes us to the other side of the question. We've talked about energy in the terms of gas powered cars versus electric vehicles, the power grids. We haven't talked at all about the minerals that are needed to build the batteries that go into these electric vehicles, that are going to go into the power lines for the power grid, that's going to be needed for these batteries that, are going to go into the communities, or large scale batteries to save the energy, so that they don't have to turn the lights on at the football stadium, as an example. Yet government policy slows that process down dramatically. It takes, a generation to permit a mine of materials that we need like yesterday.
Yeah, and that is a whole separate problem, and a whole separate problem of awareness as well. Yeah, it's such a multifaceted problem, but again, there are things that we can do. Technology, we spoke a little bit earlier about technology before turning the mics on, but I do think technology has a role to play here, and I like to couch it in terms of early risk mitigation in mining projects, collecting information early enough to accelerate decision-making processes without taking on too much risk, is another way of putting it. And here I'm talking about technical risk rather than geopolitical, which is a whole other thing. In fact, the geopolitical risks in the world, combined with the demand which will rise for these materials, actually compounds the problem rather than solving it, because we might get to a point where some of the materials we need to access just aren't available to us in the Western world, if you like, if you're listening from the Western world. And we're seeing a little bit of that with China threatening to cut off, I think it was gallium or something just recently.
Gallium, germanium, and more recently graphite.
Yeah. And it's interesting, right? So gallium, germanium, graphite, there's they control the supply of those things, but it's at the West's behest that China controls the supply of those things. Those things are not rare; they're mineable. I worked at a company that had a very large mine, and as a byproduct, it could have generated gallium actually at the time, but it didn't bother recovering it, because if it had and put it on the market, it would have completely killed the market for gallium and driven the price to almost zero. So it just wasn't in our company's best interest in doing that. Better to let just the little guys extract it and make a bit of money out of it and supply it. But there are quite a few of these things that the Chinese are threatening to withhold, which we could have an alternate supply chain for quite easily, he says, with inverted commas again. I mean, talking to some people in the US about this as well recently, and I think where things might get to is, I think we'll need to work out what we can do quickly if supply chains are cut off for some of these critical components going to manufacturing, not just our transition technologies, but also military technology, and just know where these things are and know enough about them that we could get them online really quickly. So sort of get to a point where we know the resources there, we've de-risked it, we could almost move it into a proven state, but just have it sitting there at that point. And then should things go pear-shaped in the supply chain elsewhere, we can get it up and running very quickly. Now it's a concept. It's easy to say, more difficult to pull off, of course. But the difficulty in doing things like that is it breaks the typical Western companies and their investors and shareholders and banks and financiers. It breaks the existing way that we go about doing business now. So who's going to put the money into working out that all of that's possible and then sit there and do nothing? It's just not. It's not the role, virtually not the role of the commercial world to do that. It's more of a government intervention thing. But I think to broaden some of our supply chains and make them less reliant on certain actors in the world, and to give the Western world more resilience, there's some of the things we're going to have to look into.
Well, a lot of these particular minerals, it's not, as you alluded, it's not a question of their, we mentioned a few rare earths. Rare earths really aren't that rare, but to process them, to turn them into workable minerals, is not environmentally friendly at all. And that's kind of how China ended up being the processing hub, is they don't have any environmental laws. So have at her, do whatever you want. where, most Western countries would look and go, well, no, you can't do that. And that's where we get bogged down. We have to try and figure out. And then, to my mind, that is where maybe the role of government steps in and says, okay, these are our environmental requirements. In order for you to build a processing plant, it's going to cost X hundred millions of dollars more than it should if you were, say, in China. So we'll pony up the environmental costs if you pony up the processing costs, and we'll be partners. We'll buy all the rare earths that you can process. And in the meantime, we've started to break that Chinese monopoly, but there doesn't seem to be a political will at a policy level to do that.
Yeah, it is happening to some extent. The Inflation Reduction Act is encouraging it, at least encouraging it. It's I know a couple of people here in Australia that are in companies that are spending a lot of time in the US at the moment talking about building plants in the US for beneficiation of materials and extraction of materials, the critical and battery materials, if you like, which of course annoys me a bit. I mean, why the hell do we need to go and move, build these plants and train the expertise overseas? Why can't we do it here? That is not a lesson that's lost on Australia and is causing some consternation here. We have a reputation of being a quarry to the world and not delivering any bloody technology around the downstream processing of it. But the government is slowly coming around there. I think they've just indicated that they will release another $2 billion just recently to fund critical mineral infrastructure, which includes the downstream processing, which is good. So they seem to be coming to the party. And in fact, I think our Prime Minister was in the US just last week and was talking about that. So in a weird way, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US is sort of forcing Australia to get its act together to have more of that downstream processing onshored, if you like, rather than now having it go off to the Americans. Sort of interesting that we would happy to ship it all off to the Chinese. Now we can ship it off and do it in the US. Now we're finally coming to the conclusion, why don't we do it here? But you're quite right, to do it here or the US requires government backing, because the Chinese, of course, run a completely different economic ruler over these things, and just with a much longer time frame, and will set up their production capacity and then flood the market and make it economic for other people to enter the market, which is it's a good long-term strategy. It's certainly kept people out of multiple markets. But we need to compete with that sort of mindset. We need our own governments to be thinking in a similar way, actually.
Yeah, and I think as we move to the bifurcated world economically, I'm thinking that China is going to start to lose some of that monopolistic control, because the West isn't going to necessarily want to be reliant upon one supplier that can cut it off from everything.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be either. It's hindsight's 100%, but we should never have ended up in this situation. But now it's sort of universally acknowledged as a problem. But it is a problem for China, and of course, it's not just the critical minerals downstream processing side of things either. Now, the amount of foreign investment going into China has dropped in the last 6-12 months to almost zero. You've got even Apple moving their supply chain out of China into India and Vietnam, I think. Just about all of the Western world's worried about it. And I think that's actually driving some of the more conciliatory gestures that are coming out of China, especially towards Australia, which people would have seen in the media the last couple of weeks, are sort of a blatant recognition that the Chinese had created a bad actor impression of themselves in the world. And that was, lots of, the friend-shoring, onshoring supply chains, getting supply chains out of China because they'd illustrated they were willing to use it as a geopolitical economic weapon. Sort of all backfiring a bit now. But, no one wants to see that relationship go completely south by any means. I mean, the level of interconnectedness with the rest of the world and China is just enormous. It's a completely different proposition than talking about Russia or elsewhere. So we need to just an adequate level of de-risking and onshoring and onshoring supply chains to ensure resilience, so we make our own stuff when we need to make it without completely blowing up the relationship, is a job probably best left to the politicians. I would think, Mike. But man, it's
probably the diplomats. The politicians aren't very diplomatic.
Yes. You just assume most of that happens before the politicians arrive, and it's the diplomats have sorted it all out.
I'm laughing you saying though that China is being friendly to Australia. Just today, the Chinese took their pandas and went home from the United States. So,
well,
different part of the world, different reaction. What can I say?
Well, and of course, the Canadians have booted the Chinese out of some of the mining and exploration projects as well in Canada, which that's a move we haven't even pulled that one off here in Australia yet.
No, and that that lends us back to the policy discussions. If there's more and more geopolitical risk of people nationalizing their mining industries, it's going to become increasingly more of a challenge for Western nations to get the minerals they need to build the electric vehicles, the batteries, the power lines, the small nuclear reactors that are all going to go into this green economy.
Yeah. Nicholas Taleb, who wrote a couple of excellent books, one of his latter books was Anti-Fragility, and it sort of resonates with this discussion as well. How do you make yourself resilient or not fragile? We had a perfect example of this just yesterday here in Australia. We have two dominant internet and mobile phone service providers in Australia. One of them went black. Just everything went offline for, I don't know, started at 4 a.m. Things weren't coming back online till the middle of the afternoon. And people are now thinking, going, man, trains stopped. Trains couldn't run. O emergency numbers weren't working. Whole businesses had no access to payment systems. We're talking about millions and millions of people in Australia for hours and hours and hours. So people are scratching their heads now and going, man, the system is so fragile. Just one private operator can have a problem and take down virtually half the Australian economy and its activity for hours on end. And it's a bit, these discussions are all parallel like that. So now there's thoughts in the government about why don't the telcos have to share infrastructures? Why, if your systems go down, why can't the mobile towers automatically be rerouted to your competition to maintain coverage? So, and then again, this is another conversation, a bit like this mining conversation, about trying to get rid of single points of failure in the supply chains.
Yeah, no, definitely. Technology itself is going to have to play a role in all of this. And, if we will go back to the mining side of things, I come from an oil and gas part of the country, so I relate a lot of stuff to oil and gas, and I know we're talking about green economy, so it sounds strange, but in the oil and gas industry, a number of years ago, everyone was talking about peak oil, meaning that we already gotten all the easy to get to oil, and therefore the price of oil as an energy source was going to continue to go up and up and up and up. And they were talking about $200, $250, $300 a barrel. And then lo and behold, we had a technological breakthrough called fracking, which made it a lot easier to get some hard to get to oil. And all of a sudden that, those comments about peak oil disappeared. There has to be some change in technology in the way we're mining some of these minerals in order to get at them a lot quicker and a lot more efficiently than we're currently getting at them. And I think technology is going to have to play a role in these solutions as well.
Yeah. Thinking about unlocks, if you like, and what unlocks are potentially in the pipeline in the minerals industry to increase supply without blowing up prices and in a timely fashion. I think one of the thing that's not been cracked yet, but I'm sure it's being worked on in little labs around the world, is almost an equivalent to the fracking that came about in oil and gas. More difficult, of course, in minerals, but if you could get into mineral deposits and mine them with a drill rig rather than mining them with a mine per se, key difference with oil and gas is the well is the mine, which simplifies things. If we can have a similar scenario in minerals where the drill hole is the mine, then you just don't have the delays with building infrastructure, the capital expenditure, the massive ground disturbance, and the stuff that goes on and on and on, which leads to the generational long time period it takes from exploration to production in some cases. But if we could, and I'm not saying this is solved in any way, shape, or form at the moment, but if certain ore deposit styles were amenable to it, containing sulfides of copper, nickel, cobalt, etc., if they could be fracked, if you like, so if we could do a lot of drilling, of course, but get down there and then inject explosives and materials into the areas where the mineralization is, pump down a elixir vent, which is just some chemicals that dissolve the materials to bring them up, and then you can reprecipitate them, or some bugs, or pump bugs down there and leave them for a month and then pump out whatever they've managed to digest when they're down there. Things like that may be a pathway to the future. Other things could be the traditional processing, crushing, grinding, flotation, etc., to get the sulfide minerals out is also very intensive. If we could bring them out, still mine the materials, but then leach them at the surface on a pad. So that would be another way potentially of getting access to metals more quickly and cheaply and be able to prosecute lower grade deposits. Although if you still to get the material out, you need to be careful about that. The trick there from a technology point of view is leaching sulfide materials rather than oxide. There are, in Arizona, actually, there are copper mines there which are mined like roll front uranium deposits. So in situ leaching works in that case, but they're copper oxides. But copper sulfides, not yet. But there are people working on elixir vents that can dissolve copper sulfides. So that may be something which can enhance or bring metals on stream. There's also a lot of known resources. There are a lot of known copper resources, just for example, around the world, which aren't in production for one reason or another. Sometimes geopolitical, lack of water, near to war zones. Sometimes technical. So those could be. I'm surprised. Those could be re-looked at. One of them has been on that list for a long time. It's actually Reko Diq, which Barrick has now, and is now looking at getting into production. So it was what you'd call a stranded asset for a long time, just because of its location near the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. But nevertheless, the appetite for risk has changed, and Barrick is looking at working with partners in Pakistan and bringing that into production. I think also talking to Martin in Saudi to come in and join that project. Who would have thought that would have even happened 3 or 4 years ago? That's pretty amazing. And then the other thing is remediation of mined materials that have already been mined. So this is less well known, but there are tailings dams around the place which have valuable materials in them. And a lot of companies carry on their balance sheet a liability for these things. So if they can be remediated, that gets that liability off the balance sheet. But if they can be remediated and they contain valuable commodities which can be extracted at the same time, and then that almost kills 2 birds with 1 stone. The problem with a lot of the older tailings is no one really knows what's in them, and that's another. You need to go out and define what is in these tailings dams in the first place to see if there's an economic accumulation of materials that are sitting in there. The fact they've already been mined, of course, takes a lot of the cost out, and the fact that you can remediate an area if you reprocess it, and perhaps even you remediate the area, you recover valuable components from it, and tailings are a particular type of material. They've had a lot of stuff done to them, in inverted commas. Can those tailings themselves be repurposed into some sort of a construction material or something else that's useful? So these are things that people are thinking about in the industry and are really quite positive. I know you opened up this morning, Mike, and we're a bit depressed talking about the reality gap, but if we're going to talk about things that close the gap, I think this combination of government policy, government backing, government investment in what the Western mining industry is trying to do to help it out in the face of unrealistic competition, and some of these new technologies to release new supplies of metals and minerals onto the market, which can also have an environmental implication and help companies balance sheet liabilities. Maybe that's not such a miserable combination of things to look at anymore. Maybe there's a pathway out of it.
Definitely. I work with a company here in Canada called Backtech Environmental, and they're a bioleaching company, and they're in the process of putting together a pilot plant in the Sudbury nickel belt, and they're going to be able to separate the iron and the nickel and cobalt out of the pyrrhotite tailings. And as a geologist yourself, you'll know that pyrrhotite is very, very volatile. It has to be stored underwater, otherwise it combusts. So we did a back of napkin calculation at a conference probably well over a year and a half ago, when they just started the process of getting the approvals for just the pilot prove that we can still do this economically plant. And we figured that there was somewhere in the neighborhood of 48 billion tons of nickel sitting in the tailings from 120 years worth of nickel mining in that region. Now it's, Sudbury is for those that don't know, it's a very large nickel belt that takes up, hundreds of square miles. And if you go through that area, it looks like a moonscape from all the mining and stuff that's been done over the years. So not only is this good that we get critical metals out of it, but it's going to make a huge environmental cleanup of an area that's in desperate need of.
Yes, yeah, that's fascinating. It really is, and all good ideas start on the back of a beer coaster or a napkin in a restaurant somewhere.
Well, we used to have a saying in university: it's a good idea if it survives the hangover.
I won't make any more comments about that, Mark. That's very good.
So if people want to follow Imdex and the work that you're doing, how would they do so?
They can find me on LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest way to find me, or ask me if you've got any other questions. My surname is strange enough that if you just type it in, you'll find it. And of course, we have our own website that you can go and look at. But really, if people are interested in some of these topics and talking about them further, probably best just to go onto LinkedIn there and rustle me up. Yeah,
that's Dr. Dave Lawie. It's spelled Lawie. He's very receptive to these conversations, and we're going to continue on how are we going to close this gap over the next several months. And I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yes, thanks, Mike, for having me on the pod again, and I will see you in London in a few weeks.
Oh, that is correct. For those of you who are going to be in London at the end of November, the 28th through the 30th, there is a conference there called Resourcing Futures, and they'll be talking about topics just like Dr. Dave and I have been talking about here today. So if you're in London, it'd be a good place to take a look at some of the investments in some of these more technical areas of the mining, and how we as an industry are looking to solve some of these problems.
Yeah, good tip, Mike.
Look forward to seeing you in London and talking again soon. The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.